Great. Thanks, Joe. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Kevin Hancock. I'm the host today. I'm going to give people about 2 more minutes who might be running a little late today. And so we're going to get started at 2 minutes past the hour. Just hang tight and we'll get started then. Hi, everyone. For those of you who have just joined us, just want to let you know we're going to start at 2 minutes past the hour. Give 1 more minute for those latecomers to get on board, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So just sit tight. We're going to start in about 1 minute. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming today. So my name is Kevin Hancock. I'm Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And thanks for joining today's webinar, Ask the Assessor, where I'm joined by a team of experts from Guernsey to answer your questions about CMMC and upcoming assessments when you're going to be asked to have that certified third party come and assess you on your controls. There we go. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. So today's webinar is scheduled to last from 45 minutes to 1 hour. That does include a Q&A, and today's session is really focused around that question and answer. You'll be muted to enable our speakers to present without interruption. As I mentioned, we're going to focus a lot of today's on the questions. These questions were submitted by you when you signed up for the webinar, so we've gone through those. We've grouped them into different topics, and we're going to let the panel discuss those. If for some reason you do get disconnected today and you do have an outage, just wait for a minute, refresh the page, or use that link that you received in the invite to get reconnected, and you should pick up. For your convenience, there is a link in the YouTube description for a glossary of commonly used terms, acronyms, and initializations that will be referenced during today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available on demand via the Exostar resource library. This can be reached at www.exostar.com/resources anytime after the event. You can also re-watch it by using that YouTube link you received in your email as well. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts, if you want to get a copy of this slide deck, you can reach out to us via email at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can use the live chat feature on our website at www.exostar.com. Any page there has a chat button, and we'd be happy to talk to you about any topic that you have interest in. So today's agenda, pretty straightforward. I'm just going to introduce the session and the participants today. I'm going to do, I think it's 3 slides on kind of the current state of CMMC. We're then going to jump into the questions and answers. And we've broken the questions into 4 major topic areas. One around just a lot of general questions about CMMC. We got quite a few questions about tools, specific controls, and how to address those. We're going to ask Guernsey about the assessment process and what to expect in that. And then we'll answer the questions that came about, like what's next in this journey that we are all upon. So with that, our panel, as I mentioned before, comes from Guernsey, an Exostar partner who is a C3PA organization. Timothy Fawcett leads this organization, and I'm going to let him talk about the team and Guernsey itself. Tim, you want to introduce everybody and Guernsey? I think you're on mute, Tim. You knew it was going to happen.
That's why we said on mute, like, oh, make sure you put it on mute because we can't have a conference without saying, hey, you're on mute. So at least we got to start it right. I think in the interest of time, I think everybody wants to get to the questions. So I'll just, briefly talk about the team in Guernsey and let them do a brief introduction when they actually start doing talking. But we have Laura, Matt, and Fred are all members of the team. We've all worked in different capacities, helping with all kinds of compliance, especially CMMC and State 171. But a little bit about Guernsey is, we've been around for about 95 years. Now, admittedly, we haven't been doing cybersecurity that whole time, but a lot of it. We are one of the first C3POs out there, so we've been in this from the beginning and have been on this journey. And not only have we been on the journey as a C3PO, Guernsey is a DoD contractor. We have quite a few large government contracts or a large DoD contractor. So we've been in this process that capacity as well. We are a consulting firm, but given that we are also an engineering firm, we really don't sell particular platforms or services or software. We encourage folks to use tools that work best for them. We work closely with Exostar to make sure that when those tools are being used, that they're being used well. But we have a great team here. Couldn't be more happy. We are located in Oklahoma, and again, we've been around for a long time. So that's all we got to say about Guernsey right now, and we'll get going.
All right, thanks, Tim. So again, we did get a number of questions just about what's the current state, what do you expect, etc. So that's why I just kind of put 3 slides together to kind of cover that information. So quite a few of the questions were about, well, what what level of CMMC might I need for my organization? And I use this slide, if you will, to let organizations know that the best indicator of what you're going to need when CMMC comes into effect is kind of what you're doing today. So if you look at your current contracts and what you're currently required to do, right? So look at those DFARS clauses. If your contracts only include FARS clauses, right, mainly 52204-12, then you're really looking at level 1. You're really concerned with contract information and securing that. So you still have things you have to do, right? There are 17 practices that you're going to have to adhere to as part of that, and you've really signed up for that today. Right. Level 2 is if you've got those DFARS clauses, 252, 204, 7012, 7019, 7020. That means there is a chance or you are receiving controlled unclassified information. You should already be doing self-assessments of how you're doing against those NIST 800-171 controls. You should have already generated your SSP, POAMs, etc. So, again, that's kind of where, so you'd be looking at level 2 assessment. And then if, level 3 are for those who are in the critical CUI category, or you have multiple programs, etc. So again, if you look at where you are today, it's a great indicator of where you're going to be when CMMC takes effect, if you will. Now, with that said, there's been some, not consternation per se, but there's been some confusion about when actually CMMC will take effect. And tell you the truth, all of us still don't know. The ruling, if you will, is still in the hands of the Department of Defense. It hasn't been turned over yet to the Office of Management and Budget to be put into effect. And when it does go over, there's a question of in which way will it come out? Will it come out as an interim final rule? If that's the case, you would expect a quicker implementation, if you will, or will it come out as a notice of proposed rulemaking in which they will gather feedback from industry, from Congress, et cetera. They take that feedback, they work all that out, and then the rule gets pushed to a more finalized phase. It's most people today expect it to come out as a notice of proposed rulemaking. So we're looking, somewhere 2024 with an implementation probably in 2025. But again, all this is subject to change based on when the rule actually gets submitted and when the rule actually and what kind of format it comes out. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have more news fairly quickly. So, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything you need to do today. As I mentioned before, if you've got contracts today with the Department of Defense or you're a subcontractor for the Department of Defense, you've probably signed contracts with FARs and DFARS clauses. Those things require you to do things. And part of those things are a NIST 800-171 self-assessment. You need to score yourself on that self-assessment and create that what's called a DAM score, that DoD assessment methodology score. Submit that score into the SPURS system and periodically update that score as you address those POAMs that you may have opened because you did your self-assessment, you realized your shortcomings, etc., and you've created those plan of action and milestones to close those off. So as you go through that, you're also getting ready for CMMC itself. So, we're going to follow those same rules, those same guidelines, etc. when the assessment organizations come in under the CMMC rules and do those third-party assessments to see how you're doing. So please don't just sit and do nothing. There are still things you can do today to get ready for this. Okay, so with that, as I mentioned before, we've taken the questions and we've broken them into general topic areas. The first area is just really around some general CMMC questions. And I've broken them into slides as well. So Tim, this first one I think is for you. So what's at stake if my company cannot certify CMMC compliance?
Thanks, Kevin. And again, we have about 20 questions to get through here, so I'm going to try to keep this everything as brief as possible. I think the main thing we want to reiterate is that CMMC is not a rule yet, and when it does become a rule, the answers to these questions become a lot more clear. But what we do know is that CMMC is mostly synonymous with NIST 800-171, which is a requirement now. If you don't submit your scores to SPRS now, then you will not be able to bid on certain contracts. In the future, the state would be that if you are not CMMC compliant, you will not be able to get the contract. That does not necessarily mean that you can't win a contract, but at least in 1.0, there was a time frame in which it would take for you to become compliant. So there are some questions later about timing and things like that. But generally speaking, what we would expect is that in order to execute on a contract, you would have to be CMMC compliant with a third-party attestation if it's required. Let's see. I think the current method of enforcement for this is going to be the False Claims Act. One of the things is there penalties. And even today, if you go into SPRS, for instance, and you quote, hey, I'm a score of 110, and DIPCAT came in, or you had a breach or something to that effect, they could actually prosecute you under false claims for saying, hey, I got this, I'm at this level on my CMMC or my NIST 800-171 compliance. Turns out you're not, and there was a breach. They could actually prosecute you under the False Claims Act. That's the government's least that's what they communicated as being their hammer. And then again, the stick on the carrot on the other side is their ability to actually get the contracts. Um, so I think that's
Okay. Thanks,
on that.
Tim. So thank you. So Fred, this one's for you. So why don't you introduce yourself and after I ask you the question. So Fred, do all military and or space programs require CMMC certification? As a company with no direct DoD contracts, but I do supply a primary contractor, do I require a C3PAO, sorry, to certify us? So let me stop there for now.
Absolutely. So, guys, my name is Fred Shergy. I'm one of the provisional assessors for CMMC. And as you see, we have a laundry list of questions here. So I think the easiest way to handle this one is just go line by line and bullet point them. So the first question, do all military and space require CMMC certification? And the answer to that is no. In fact, the document you'd want to go look at for that one in particular is the DFARS Rule 2019 D041, where it kind of breaks down what contracts over the last 4 years have had what requirements in them. And if you kind of generalize off that, because the DoD only goes so far into the contract process, you can kind of assume about 3/4 of the organizations out there are only going to have FCI and require level 1 self-attestation. The remainder, though, will have level 2 accredit or certification for CMMC. As a company with no direct contracts but supplies a primary contractor, do we require C3POs to certify us? Yes and no. So let's walk through this one. The CMMC certification is for everybody in the defense industrial base, not just those with a direct contract with the DoD. That's part of the flow down process in the DFARS 7012. So yes, if you have that flow down, you are required. Now, as of today, there is a stipulation that some level 2 organizations can self-attest to this. But to be honest, we don't know the full details on that one. So at this moment, I wouldn't hang my hat on it. Next question. Our sales department asks what projects require CMMC before quoting. So with the majority of contracts out there, this is going to be set up front when you're looking at the RFP, RFQs, if you're going to need this or not. But let's be very honest about the industry. There are a lot of contracts out there today that have the DFARS 7012 requirement, but don't necessarily need it. This is a known issue. So with a sales team, this is something every organization needs to sit down intimately with each request they're going after and saying, okay, with contracting officer, this is a requirement, yes or no? And if yes, can you explain why? So that way, if it's something that truly needs it, and you're going to have CY, absolutely walk down this path. But if there's no reason you only have FCI, try to have that clause taken out of your contract. Is level 3 required to be assessed and certified by a C3PAO? I'm going to pause on that one for a second. And the reason I'm pausing is I'm not sure if there's a terminology difference here or what's going on. So we're going to answer this 2 ways. In CMMC 2.0, level 3 is done by DIBCAC. The C3PAOs only do 1 and 2 level stuffs in 2.0. But in the version CMMC version 1.0, the level 3, now currently level 2, would require a certification, yes. And again, we're not sure about what those self-attestation ones are going to be. Next question is, when is the deadline for certification? Well, there's not really a deadline. This isn't like taxes are due by April 15th. What's going to happen is, as this becomes law, these requirements are going to be rolled into contracts over a period of time. And you can kind of think of a standard adoption model for businesses for how that's going to happen. It's going to start off with a very few subset of contracts and slowly build over time. And realistically speaking, that process can probably take 6 or 7 years until the majority of government contracts have them. Next question is, how do we know the third party is a C3PAO? So for this particular question, the CyberAB at cyberab.org has a marketplace that you can go right now and look up everybody that's within this ecosystem and what their roles and responsibilities are. So if you go there, look at marketplace, select C3PAO, and the 35-ish of us will pop up and you can select from there. And the final question, at this point, do we know who will need a C3PAO assessment and opposed to the self-certification? Unfortunately, right now, we don't know what these are going to be. And it gets kind of convoluted because you have both the requirements that the DoD is going to push forward, and primes can do what they want when forcing their own rules. So it might be the DoD says no, but a prime says yes. So that's just one of those things we have to look at on a per contract basis.
Thanks, Matt, for that very complete answer. Oh, I'm sorry, Fred. See, that's what I get for looking at my sheet here. Sorry about that, Fred. But that does bring us to our next panel member, Matt. So Matt, how closely does the CMMC 2.0 align with 800-171?
Good question. Thanks, Kevin. Howdy, folks. My name is Matt Watson. I'm a cybersecurity consultant at Guernsey. Kevin, I got to give you a shout out because I think you said in 12 minutes regarding the status of the CMMC what some people take entire conferences to say. So well done on that one. So how closely does CMMC 2.0 align with 800-171 alpha? Real quick orientation just for the audience, just in case they didn't know. NIST is a federal agency. The 800-171 is a document that has 110 cybersecurity practices in it. The 800-171 alpha, which is referenced here, is a document that just says, how do you assess those 110 practices in the 800-171? So it's really for an assessor or somebody preparing for that test to say, what do I need to really prove to an auditor, right? How does that relate to the CMMC 2.0? The CMMC 2.0 is the current program. The 2.0 is the nuts and bolts of what you're going to have to actually perform comes from the 800-171. Those 110 practices in 800-171 equal what you have to do for CMMC 2.0. What's the difference? Well, paperwork and documentation, documenting that you're actually doing the things, okay? If you look at that 800-171 alpha, it's going to provide 3 methods to verify that you're doing a certain cybersecurity practice. Something to examine, a person to interview, and something to test, which is usually pretty technical. So it depends on the cybersecurity practice, but that 800-171 alpha is going to, with an eye towards CMMC, it's going to say for a given security practice, what could an assessor examine? A policy. Maybe it's Microsoft Active Directory, like a technology. Who can they interview? The IT person, the HR manager, the vice president of, what have you, the CFO. And what can they test? You can test a policy in certain circumstances, but a lot of times testing, for instance, one of the practices says you have to have a limit on how many unsuccessful login attempts you can have on your domain. So what can I test? Well, an assessor could actually sit down and try to log in that number of times and see if that actually works. So the 800-171 alpha is for every one of those practices. It's explaining what you can examine, who you can interview, and who you can test. If you look at the CMMC 2.0 assessment guidance document, which is provided by the Department of Defense on their website, it's going to verbatim repeat everything you see in the 800-171 alpha. It's going to have one specific difference. It's going to have this discussion section in the assessment guidance where it gives you examples. So it'll say, okay, we showed you what to examine, what to test, who to interview. That is great. Let's discuss what the intent behind this practice is so you can understand how to meet it and why this practice even matters. And the CMMC assessment guidance provided by DoD is even going to go so far as to give you some examples. So it'll ask some questions like, for the unsuccessful login attempts, it'll say, do you have a mechanism that automatically locks an end user's attempts to input additional unsuccessful login attempts or other examples? And that's there to help the testee, the person getting ready for CMMC, to think through these things. It's also there for the assessor, really, to just think of to come up with some examples, and when they're in person on site with the person they're assessing, they might think of some of these examples and some of this discussion to reference when they're testing the the cybersecurity control. So that would be my answer to that question. If meeting the NIST requirements, are there any major additions / differences that could cause a failure? If you're doing the NIST 800-171, you have to document that you're doing the 800-171. That is the difference that could cause a failure. So CMMC is a maturity model. They're going to consider maturity being you are doing the things in that 800-171, and you have documentation that you're doing the things in the 800-171. That could be policies and or technical stuff. So that would be the delta there. You have to document that what you're doing, just like a business operational plan. It's got to be written down somewhere.
Great, thanks, Matt. So our next two questions are a little nuanced. So for that, we're going to bring in Laura.
Perfect. Hey guys, Laura Fawcett here. I joined the Guernsey team a little while back, honestly came in and got us ready to go through our CMMC assessment with the DIBCAC to become a C3PAO. And I've spent much of my career in IT being assessed. So that's kind of where I fall on this spectrum. But before I jump in these, I wanted to add one little thing onto what Matt said, because that's what I love to do. The other thing to consider when you look at that CMMC scoping guide is that you're using the CMMC guidance for classifying your assets.
Good point.
Yeah, showing an architecture diagram of how those different types of assets, be it a CUI asset, security protection, risk managed out of scope, things like that. And then your data flows. So demonstrate that you know where you have CUI, where it's flowing, and that helps the assessor verify the scope that you have defined for your assessment. Because, you know, they, as assessors, we don't have the authority to assess your whole environment. It's just things that are applicable to the protection of CUI.
Great point. Thank you.
Oh yeah, fair enough. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah. So yes, Kevin, this one is a bit nuanced, and COTS comes up a lot. So, you know, when it comes to the FARS clauses with the FCI, a lot of times if it's a contract for COTS, those don't apply. Where this gets a little more gray with the CUI and particularly with subcontracting agreements is that, as Fred mentioned earlier, what your prime flows down to you and puts in a contract may require the same or more than the DoD would require with a direct contract. So if you're providing a COTS solution as part of a bigger solution on a prime contract, there is the chance that you could be getting CUI and those clauses could be there. So I would say the first thing to do is look, do you have the FARS clause for protecting FCI and or the DFARS clause in your agreement? If so, and you are getting that CUI and you need to get it to respond to an RFI or to deliver that COTS product, then you're going to be in scope and you're going to have to protect that information. If possible, my recommendation would be finding a way to work with the prime to get the information you need to support their contract and deliver that COTS product or part or solution without actually getting and bringing that CUI into your environment.
Thanks, Laura. So the second question. So we get this question a lot, right? So what is CUI? How do I recognize it? What do I, in this particular question, it's like, so we have ITAR. Is ITAR always CUI? Is CUI always ITAR? And so what do we have to do to determine whether or not what we've created is CUI? It's not something we receive, but it's something we created in the fulfillment of a contract.
Absolutely. And this is one of those questions where you'll hear us say a lot. The shorter answer is yes and no, or it depends. But on this one, the short answer is that if your contract or your task order guidance you're getting on this says, guidance you're getting from your contracting officer does not say that your work product is CUI, then it's not. Of course, if you know it's ITAR, all of those regulations are certainly going to apply. You've got to protect that data, export control, all of that. With that said, CUI, if you go out and look with the National Register, covers a broad number of things because this was really put in place to consolidate and let every federal agency use the same approach for marking and controlling sensitive information. So if you go out there and look, there is a CUI CUI category for specialized export control, which is what ITAR would fall under. So there is the chance that down the road, as DoD continues to mature in their processes and procedures for determining what they consider CUI and setting protection, down the road, they could come back to you and say, you know what, this is ITAR. There's plenty of other things out there like ITAR, like TSA's SSI, which is sensitive security information, where it falls under both categories, and they would call that specified CUI. And what that means, it's CUI, and sorry, I'm going to interchange CUI and CUI. It is clearly CUI, but it also has additional safeguarding controls through law, regulation, whatnot, that also may have further protections, export control requirements, or things like that. So really what I say is, if it's something you consider sensitive information and you realistically think down the road, DoD could come back and say, you know what, we really do need to treat this as CUI. Just keep that in mind as you're designing solutions, creating enclaves or data flows. Don't have to do it now, but make sure you're building your solution in a way that it won't break if the classification of this, not classification, excuse me, the designation of this information changes down the road.
Great, thanks.
Laura, we into this sometimes too. A lot of conversations we have related to control systems, which are explicitly removed from scope under the CMMC scoping guide. But we know that there's information coming out of those systems that the government feels pretty strongly about. According to what we said, is no one told them so far, hey, this pressure reading that you're giving to us every week is CUI. But we honestly think that in the future that could change. So our advice is don't ignore it. It's possible that
and that is a good point, particularly in the critical infrastructure space or things like that. There's data manufacturing even that today is coming out of or generated by industrial control systems or, manufacturing floors, things like that. Currently, those are considered specialized assets and they really are out of scope. But to Tim's point, we are seeing the desire and push to continue to expand what is considered CUI. So again, think about the type of data that you might be reporting to the DoD or sharing with them. And again, just as you're defining the scope of your environment, think of some of those what ifs. You obviously can't plan for future unknowns. But we do expect what falls under CUI to continue to expand as time goes on and the process matures.
Sure. Okay. Great. So let's move on. So we're going to go to topic 2 now. So we got quite a few questions again about very specific controls. Some questions about SaaS services and other services that people engage, and different technical questions. So we're going to cover those next. Laura, hopefully you didn't go too far because the next one's for you. So, as small business rely on a number of SaaS solutions, Exostar itself provides, we are a cloud service provider as well, so we provide some of these as well. So how can we ensure we're selecting products that will pass compliance?
Absolutely. And I love this question. So for things kind of mentioned here, vulnerability scanning, endpoint protection, virus scanning, really the most important thing to consider is that you need to ensure those products help you meet the requirements. You're using those are in place to protect your environment and also to make sure you're meeting these expectations for protection of endpoints, for identifying and remediating vulnerabilities. So, for endpoint protection, keep in mind things like automatic signature updates, regular scanning, ability to control mobile code, which I think we're going to talk about more later. And as well as the implementation of these tools, because definitely think about how you're putting them in your network. You're having to make firewall changes to support these tools. Are you documenting that? or how are you collecting and monitoring logs or alerts from these tools? So those are the things to really keep in mind. It's not as much which tool you're using, it's more how you've implemented it and how you're using to meet your objectives. Really the only place to keep in mind significant impact from cloud tools is if you're using tools to actually store the CUI. These tools here we're talking about are security protection assets, so you're good to go. There are additional requirements around FedRAMP moderate compliance or equivalency for cloud solutions that are used to process, store, or transmit CUI.
Yep, that actually leads us right to the next question, which I'm going to really direct to Fred here. So Fred, for organizations that share certain cloud services, right? Maybe they're using Azure Active Directory as their corporate directory, but they're using other things as well between both their CUI enclaves and their general business systems. How's that viewed by a C3PO?
Okay,
the GUI isn't actually transmitted or stored in those, but how do we kind of classify those and work with them?
So I'm going to prelude my answer of yes, Active Directory is in there by kind of backfilling on one thing. One of the areas that we see a lot with organizations when they're walking through this process is they're not paying attention to their CUI flow. And as you're walking this path, you really do have to have a great understanding from birth to death where your CUI is in your organization and what programs and services you have that are helping that process through the line. This is a particular one where we're talking about Active Directory, where it can be in control of both pieces, both your CUI area and your non-CUI area. But how do you make sure you're supplying it? Well, the way we break this one down is, yes, it's part of your environment, so it's going to be investigated. And we're going to be doing things by looking at how's multi-factor authentication set up? Who has access to Active Directory? You want to make sure these pieces like Active Directory or firewalls that might be shared or anything else that might be shared is set to the higher bar, because you can always go up, but you can't go down.
Fair enough.
I think this partially goes into what Laura was talking about with the different types of assets and the CMMC scoping guide. A lot of the assets here are going to be considered like Active Directory. That's going to be a security asset, right? So there's certain requirements for that. It may or may not have CUI in it, but if it's a security asset, it will have to be assessed to applicable 171 controls, which may or may not include the controls related to CUI.
Right. So oftentimes I really see there's those two things the kind of two things you have to look at, but it's both that data, that flow diagram, right? This is how CUI enters and transits my system, if you will. But then, kind of as Laura mentioned before as well, that architecture diagram, if you will, and how I split up those different pieces of my system and where I categorize them. And each of those things are very important to include as part of your system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Laura, I'm going to call you back to the table here for the next one. Very specific control here. NIST 800-171 control 3.1.18, control connection of mobile devices.
Right. So I'm going to start again with this depends, but the biggest dependency here is your scoped environment and if the users can access CUI from those mobile devices. If your network and system design prevents mobile devices from processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, then you can mark this control in A. You may have to demonstrate to an assessor how you prevent that. But if the device could process, store, or transmit CUI, then that's where you're going to need to demonstrate how the device is identified first of all. So I feel like a lot of this always ties back to that basic 311, identifying the processes, the systems, the people, and the devices connecting to the environment. You're going to have to show that those connections are how they're authorized, how they're monitored, how they're logged, multi-factor. So most of us are going to say probably the easiest way to do that is through mobile device management, but that is not the only way. Again, at the end of the day, you have to demonstrate if that device has CUI, how you're meeting those 110 requirements to protect it. The biggest thing there, again, also, if it's stored on the device, is that encryption and those related controls as well.
Thank you. So Fred, this next one's for you, again, about very particular controls. And, I'm sorry, if I could talk. So if a company's only wireless network is limited to just connecting to an on-premise server, no further connections to the higher enterprise network where the CUI actually resides, does that mean that 316.16 and 3.1.17 are implemented or not applicable?
So again, this is going back to our flow we were talking about earlier, where we have a wireless system that does not have access to our CUI environment. So in this particular instance, for this wireless environment, 3.1.6, which is the non-privileged account use, and 3.1.7, which is the privileged functions, don't apply to this. And so that wireless system would be not actable.
Okay, fair enough. So Tim, I'm going to bring you back to the discussion here for this one. And so this is about the individuals and how how we screen those individuals prior to authorizing their access to organizational systems containing CUI. So in an audit, will it be enough if they are just U.S. citizens? Are background checks required? Or will it be accepted if the company just needs to document how they decide who will be given access?
This is actually one of the examples I like to give is that it's really easy to read this or some of the examples and make jumps, and assessors can make jumps about what is really expected here. But at the very minimum, it says that you need to do background checks, which generally requires screening and vetting, making sure that someone who's expected to have a certain level of background check to verify their experience, their credentials, and their education. Do they have the qualifications to do the job? Do they have the the standards? Are they trusted enough to be able to access information? And only in very specific circumstances would CUI have a citizenship requirement. In fact, it's not uncommon for unclassified information to be accessed by non-citizens. So nowhere is that even a great test to confer this control. And most likely the background checks that you're doing, that your HR department is performing, criminal background checks, those sort of things will suffice. The important part from a assessment standpoint is make sure that you're documenting that those background checks are being done, the purpose of them, and that they're being completed completely. There's no citizenship requirements tied to.
And I would add on also the need to know. I mean, that's one of the things with CUI is you shouldn't really have access to it unless you need it to do your job. So that also could be a criteria for vetting a person before giving them access. Do they really need it?
True.
Absolutely. Great. Okay. Hey, Matt, we're coming back to you. So for 313.2, right, another very specific control. Well, not really specific, but one of those overarching controls. So how do you recommend an organization presents evidence that designs and techniques are employed that promote effective security?
You're right, Kevin. That's a very overarching control. If you look at the assessment guidance, it's going to have the control, and there's a bunch of sub-controls under that. So there's 6 sub-controls, and it uses very specific terms here that's the questioner is hitting on, specifically the word design and technique. The long story short here is you have to have good documentation, and it probably should be in accordance with NIST guidance. So how do I recommend a company present evidence that, let's look at the control, that they've got architectural designs that is specified by the question? I would advise that evidence of designs equals diagrams. You need to have a network diagram that shows your IT enterprise. And to Laura's earlier point, you're going to be required to have a scoping diagram that shows not just your IT enterprise, but really scoped down what pieces of that enterprise are going to be in scope for CMMC. In other words, they're handling CUI. So evidence of designs, I would advise, is going to be diagrams, whether that's Visio or, I'm not going to prescribe to certain specific product. There's many ways to hit that, but you need to have some sort of drawing, for lack of a better term, of how your network is actually interconnected. And NIST puts out guidance on how to do this and how you can show that you've got good defense in place. Here's my firewall, but also I have some switching gear and I've got VLANs set up. So even if it makes it past the firewall, there's other layers of protection for traffic being routed. The other piece of the question is techniques. In reference to the actual question, it's talking about software development techniques in the actual question. So software development techniques are only going to apply if you develop software in-house. That is not most people that I've worked with that are beholden to CMMC, but if it is, NIST has additional guidance. And it's going to, those techniques are probably going to be evident. You're going to provide evidence of those by really having a step-by-step checklist of sorts. We're looking for a very granular procedure, and it's going to look oddly like the software development lifecycle. So it's going to look something like you have a specific process as you're developing source code. How do you check that for security flaws? Do you have a DevSecOps type team that's looking through that source code for security flaws? That would be a good starting point. Do you have some sort of check and balance system so that before you deploy the code or make a new branch for a new version or something, that's being checked for security issues? That's what I would recommend for techniques. And then finally, there's a piece that's not in this question, but I think we should hit on, which is the word principles is also mentioned in that control. And it's not flowery, but it's kind of it's almost like your philosophy on how you create new pieces of your IT enterprise. And guess what? NIST makes guidance on that. My recommendation would that for all of these, you would reference NIST guidance because it's free, number one, and number two, that's what the CMMC content is based on. So you really can't go wrong there, I would advise. But in terms of the principles, I would write something that looks oddly like a system development life cycle. So before I onboard new hardware onto my network, I have a positive change control process where I vet that equipment for security flaws and issues. Maybe some supply chain risk management processes are in there. But you're going to want to tell in a story an assessor with this control that you've got some documentation, you've got processes, business processes in place where you've got positive control over your environment. Everything's documented. And before you build new pieces onto your IT enterprise, you're thinking through that from a security lens.
So I want to add on to that. That's absolutely right, and it is one of those things. And Matt's saying, here's what I would suggest, and the reason we're suggesting that is because you don't really want to leave very much up to the imagination of your assessor. I mean, if they're not, you said, well, here's what it is. Here's the diagram. That's the idea of that level of documentation in the sources. If you go to the NIST guidance to create that documentation, there's a much it's much harder for them to dispute, and that I'm not saying that not all assessors are have the same backgrounds and experiences, but sometimes you just want to make sure your bases are covered. The other thing I wanted to mention about this, and I think I just want to make sure it's clear, because the way I read the question is it almost seemed like the term employed may have been referenced. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that this has nothing to do with the skills are tied to the individuals that are employed by the company. The employed means in place at the company. So if there was any confusion there, we just want to make sure that the assessor is not going to be looking for certifications or anything like that. That's not the same.
Certifications, exactly.
Yeah, that is a good point. Good point. And I will tack on one other thing and I loved Matt's answer here. It was spot on. Some of this you can point to other controls you've already demonstrated, because some of these processes and controls and frameworks you have in place, are included with your change control process, as Matt pointed to, your SDLC, your configuration baseline. So it also helps. You want to have those policies and guidance there, but you can also, with the assessor, point to and say, hey, look, what I showed you for configuration baselines, we use that across the board as part of our, environment architecture. So
I know in our
that one to
environment,
death.
what I'm not going to do is more. I know in our environment, we have, when changes are made or new software is added to it, the IT is required to follow a questionnaire that, security questionnaire that
Yeah.
depending on the answers go to different things. But that's a really good way to show that for each and every major change that a particular process was followed and certain answers were questions were answered. So
Yeah,
I know we're
absolutely.
only halfway through here. We'll start talking a lot faster. Sorry.
No problem. So it's okay. I'm gonna move us along a little bit.
Yes.
I'm gonna jump, if you will, the next two questions and go right to the next section. This is about the assessment itself. So we had some questions about what happens about both engaging with a C3PAO and as well as what to expect when they come on site. So the first one, Tim, over to you. Can a C3PAO perform consulting and readiness services as well?
Okay, now I'll answer this. I want to make sure that we're not intentionally trying to avoid the question about tips because I know everybody's on the edge of their seats. So
it's always
asked.
asked.
Go back to it. I want to make sure that we understand that a C3PO, obviously there's some restrictions against performing both consulting services. So, I can't come in there and say, you need to put these procedures in place and we need to monitor, things for you or tell you how to do things. And then we can't then come back and assess our own work. So if I've come in and if you engage somebody, which I highly suggest you do, somebody to come in and help you prepare, they can't be the same one to do that. But I can tell you that C3POs can certainly provide consultant and readiness of services. I would make the argument that one thing you can say about the C3PAOs is they've been through the assessment, they've passed the assessment, which is not, which is for any number of reasons is there's only 35 companies right now who have actually done that. Now you lose their ability to be able to come back into your assessment, but you get a lot of input into how you, or even have them sitting next to you and helping you decide which assessor aligns with your values and your goals and bringing them in there. So I know there's some discussion out there that the C3POs can't do that, and I would want to make sure that we reiterate that they can, and in most cases it should be an option. It's something you should definitely consider. So.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm gonna keep you here for the next question because and I want to answer this one because we've discussed it quite a bit already. This need not only that you've actually implemented something, but that question of what proof or what do I need to actually say it. So this was what will the auditors be looking for to substantiate that requirements are actually be complied with?
Okay, and Matt covered this pretty well earlier, but there's the three types of evidence that as an assessor we're going to come in, and of course there's the whole process for your scoping and everything else like that. But when we actually come down to look at the actual practices, we have the option of coming in and examining, interviewing, and testing. Those are the three options we have, and the way the guidance is written, we have to look at two of them. And right, wrong, or indifferent, I can decide to do an examine on all of them if I'm the lead assessor on it, and I'm because there's not a lot of guidance on there. But that doesn't mean that as the organization seeking certification, you don't really need to have two of them. You need to have all three of them. So you need to be prepared for the assessor to come and say, "Hey, show me if I want to examine. Show me the documents, your policies and your procedures and your diagrams and those things. Those are the things I want to examine." You need to be prepared to interview. I know that a lot of the guidance out there is very specific, and DIVCAC's very strict about saying, hey, if you say in your documentation that Joe Bob does this procedure, I need to be prepared to interview Joe Bob, make sure that he's doing those things that are written on that paper. So that's the second thing. And then the testing is to go in there and actually make sure that things are being done. And depending on what your background is, this kind of has a lot of nuances. I come from the external auditing world, and so there's a lot of guidance that comes around with this that isn't appropriate for this conversation. But what we do want to make sure of is that things like coming in and plugging a USB drive and make sure it gets rejected. Is that a good test? It is a test. Is it the best test? Maybe not. And there's some reasons it can be and it can't be. But what I think a good assessor would be looking for is how are you controlling those things systematically, and show me those things. So for instance, on the USB, maybe you're controlling that through GPO. So you maybe have a list of GPOs that are applied. I want to go and look at those GPOs and see how they're applied to your organization. Show me that. If you are using it through your endpoint, you have a rule in Sophos that only allows certain USB drives to attach. I want to see that rule and how it's configured throughout there and how that gets applied down. That's going to be the more complete way of doing it. But I would be perfectly prepared to make sure that somebody has a USB drive. Now, I'm not going to take my USB drive and plug it into your computer. That's just not. I don't think my contract even will allow that. But maybe if you plug your USB drive into the computer, maybe you have one that you tested before that guy came in, the assessor came in there, to make sure either a little warning pops up or nothing happens. I know it's a valid test because I believe that's actually how we were tested at Guernsey. So it is definitely a way to go, but it is not the only way. So again, 3 methods. Be prepared to meet all of them.
Okay. Thank you. So, Laura, I want to ask this next question because we get a lot of questions about overseas. I'm a European supplier, et cetera. And this question kind of addresses that. So, how are you going to assess a company which is a subsidiary of a company headquartered overseas, 100% remote, and they have their own infrastructure?
So a couple different ways to approach this. One thing to keep in mind, that the assessments are performed at the contract or the cage code level. So if the contract is with that holding or sub organization in the US, then that's where the assessment's going to be done. Again, you will assess their environment based on how it's configured, based on those architecture diagrams and CUI data flows that we've discussed. But the question specifically about non-US companies, be it parent companies, be it who holds the contract, we are still waiting on clear direction from the DoD to confirm if US C3PAOs can perform those assessments or not. But the thing to keep in mind is that they've made it very clear that compliance with 800-171 is in the contracts, and that's their expectation. And it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when the decision will be made as to who will perform those assessments. But we definitely expect they will be required. It's how the timing's going to work. And again, based on what country it is, how agreements are, what rules those countries may potentially have in place to require, citizens of their country to perform assessments, things like that. But if you are a subcontractor, I would add on with a prime, now we're not talking DoD anymore. Now we're talking your contractual obligations with your prime contractor. And that's going to be a little more cut and dry if they're requiring you to have an assessment done.
Great. Well, so we've only got a couple minutes left. So I'm going to just ask one more question. And this is kind of wraps up the kind of 3, and we've kind of said this already, but I just want to kind of address this first one up here, and I think this was going to go to Matt. So Matt, we feel like we're on track. We're ahead of the game. We got our score. We got our POAMs up. What should we do in the interim?
You've got your 3 key pieces of information. You know where you're at. That's your score. You know where you're at on the map. You know where you need to go. That's your plan of action and milestones. Now you need somebody to tell you how to get there. So we would highly advise that you get somebody that knows CMMC, lives, sleeps, eats, breathes CMMC to help you get there. Consistently, we see if you keep that internal, you can certainly do that. But a lot of times your full-time employees are not going to have the bandwidth to reference the documentation, give you that advice that you need to get where you're going on the map in a compliant manner and document everything. Does the rest of the team have something on that?
So the only thing I'd add there is that what we've consistently seen from DIBCAC itself is when they've come in and done their audits of people after that company has done a self-assessment, they've typically found a difference in scores of about 60 points from what the company assessed being higher than what they assessed when they actually did the assessment of their SSP. So just keep that in mind, everyone.
Yep.
We really suggest if you're going to put a score in Spurs to score low. And DIBCAC, there's some really great folks over there. But there has been stories of inconsistencies too. So it goes back down to assessors have their own bring their own baggage to the show. You wants to make sure that things are documented in such a way that those assessors understand that your control is designed and operating effectively. And sometimes you're going to run into those debates, but the fact is that there's certain tricks. I don't say it's tricks, but there are certain ways you can go about making that documentation and those processes work in such a way that it checks the box, that you can communicate to those assessors. And this is another one of those good examples where working with with an organization that either has worked with the C3PO or the assessors before, kind of understands what they come from, or you're working with an assessing organization, it comes a long way to making sure that you're just not having any of those surprises when you show up to get that assessment done. It's very frustrating when you think you're doing things well and the assessor comes in and has a whole different expectation. So if you're ready to go, probably your best bet is maybe to have a pre-assessment done by a C3PAO. Hey, you come in and do an assessment. Maybe it's not official yet because it doesn't, because CMMC is not actually a thing yet. But you know what 171A is. Why don't you come in and do an assessment and tell me met or not met?
Yep.
That way you'll know, you'll have a good bet. It's not consulting, and you'll probably need to work with the consultant to fill in those poems. But that's one way you can actually communicate to your management also that you're doing the right things, that your investments are correct, and that when the time comes, and there's that time frame, you don't want any surprises, and you don't want your management to have any surprises. So that's why I'd recommend.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks, Tim. And so everyone, just as we wrap up, just want to ask everyone you will find an exit poll link in the YouTube description. Would encourage everyone to please fill out that poll for us. It provides us not only feedback on how we did today, but also that's where we ask you for some additional topics you'd like to have in future webinars. Want to thank the Guernsey team, and Guernsey is a longtime partner of Exostar. They work, obviously, as you see, in this space quite a bit. They're part of our CMMC Ready suite, and one of those partners that can do those different CMMC 800-171 assessments for you, so they can do that. How are you doing against those controls today? Exostar offers a number of solutions in this space, both Certification Assistant and Policy Pro, that can help you prepare for those NIST 800-171 controls, get those policies in place that address those. If you're looking for a secure enclave that can store or process that CUI information, take a look at Exostar's managed Microsoft 365 solution. So just want to thank everybody and the Guernsey team. Thanks so much for joining me today and having this discussion. Matt, Fred, Tim, and Laura, thanks so much again. And everyone, have a great day.
Thank you, Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin. Have a great day, guys.